Victoria 3's most significant game update to date, patch 1.2.3, is arriving very soon, and today Paradox revealed all, and when I say all, I mean all. Oh my god, all. In this video, we're going to cover off the new changes that we haven't talked about before, and of course, the big sweeping changes, the features you can see on screen that are coming to Victoria 3's patch 1.2.3. And if you wouldn't mind, looking at the live count now, I think we're actually only around 600 people short of our 50,000 subscriber goal. Goodness gracious. So if you wouldn't mind grabbing 600 of your mates and hitting that button below, then we can get on with the show. Let's take a look at everything that Victoria 3's patch 1.2 has to offer, starting with some key new features. And of course, if you've seen my coverage before, you'll know some, but perhaps not all of these. Firstly, the autonomous investment pool, an opportunity for our populations to have a private economy inside of the game, where they choose what they'd like to construct based on the available funds available in their investment pool, which of course you have some control over because you set the laws. Worth noting as well that buildings now have government shares, which will pay money or subtract their losses directly into the treasury relative to the building's profits and the government's ownership share. So across the new private economy and the public sphere, we have a lot more control and potentially a lot more ways to make sweet, sweet cash. There are also some changes to command economy and a new economic law called cooperative ownership, which requires a council republic and now unlocks the workers' co-ops production method instead of council republic doing so directly. So there are also some changes around those economic laws that kind of fit in with the features. Moving away from those, of course, we have the new strategic objectives, those beautiful big arrows that can be designated by players during war, encouraging our generals to move towards specific states. This is a really nice level of player agency added into Victoria 3's adequate war system. Next up, of course, we have the in-game music player. I won't waste too much time on that, but it's there. Other new features include the fact that defeating a native uprising no longer instantly annexes them, but instead gives you colonial rights pact over them, speeding up your colonization of the territory. Of course, we also have other changes to colonization that we'll touch on a little bit later, including the fact that you can't just colonize any old where, and places like Japan now have specific holds over their rightful territories. One of the things we haven't talked about a lot in my coverage of patch 1.2 are some changes to the history, the narrative, the story in Victoria 3. One of the things that they mention here as one of the key new features are new journal entries, decisions, and events retaining to the Russo-Chinese border conflicts, the Beijing Treaty, and more. There's also a complete overhaul of certain rebellions, the Heavenly Kingdom event chain, new journal entries across the board in the Great Qing it seems, as well as all kinds of other fixes and balance changes. And finally, the thing that they put in the features category is that markets now have a land trade capacity, which allows trade routes between adjacent markets to trade a limited number of goods without needing to use any convoys at all, potentially helping minor nations and major nations alike. There's a list of improvements so long, I might as well be reading the Holy Bible. We're going to be here a very long time. So what I'm going to do is pick through some of the key improvements, either the ones that I think will make the most impact on your game, or alternatively ones that we haven't discussed before, because there are some new gems inside of this massive patch update. Let's take a look. Trade routes now trade using the market price rather than the difference between pre- and post-trade prices. What this means is that trade routes now cannot be profitable unless the price is lower in the exporting market than it is in the importing market. Makes a lot of sense. If trade bores you a little bit, you'll be pleased to know that, of course, the secondary war goals dynamic that you'll see me play around quite a bit with in this Austrian campaign is now a diplomatic play that can be locked in at the cost of infamy and maneuvers, causing them to yield their target if they back down. Basically what that means is, if you're justifying a war against the AI and you want to capture 3 states, not just one, you can set them all as primary demands, and if they decide to back down, you'll get all 3. Previously, of course, you would only get one of your demands and the rest of them would be swept under the rug. This is a very powerful change and one that I am particularly a fan of. In last week's video, we talked all about the military changes, including, of course, the strategic objectives that I talked about before. It's important to note that another improvement has come about, numerous improvements actually, to battle initiation. Mainly it's about how the game chooses which units to send in, which generals to send into the fight. And in my experience, it seems to be performing a lot better. I'd like to hear yours below though, because of course this is a little bit subjective and quite hard to manage. Touching briefly on the colonialism again, I think they make a really good point here where they say it's no longer possible to colonize a state where another country has a claim and maintains an interest. So there's a real finders, keepers, losers, weepers at play here. And of course they go on to elaborate that several claims have been added to colonizable regions where other players just shouldn't be able to start colonies, such as, for example, the main northern island of Japan, Hokkaido. Again, it's another suite of improvements to try and make the colonial system a little bit more accurate, perhaps, to life, and a little bit less able to be manipulated by a player who might just run out far and wide and send colonies literally everywhere without context or resources to fuel them. Skipping down the list a little bit, but first making note that there's been a worldwide rebalance of arable land, with land generally reduced in Europe and Asia and generally increased in the Americas. Maybe the new breadbasket of the world. But as I skip down a little bit on the list, one that stands out in particular to me is another war improvement around naval invasions. Naval invasions are no longer limited to using admirals and generals from the same HQ, but can use generals from any HQ with coastal access. Furthermore, on the front of war, if a front is resolved, any generals at that front will now only automatically reassign themselves to a nearby town if it will take at most 30 days to reach it. In case of travel durations longer than that, the general will instead stand by at their current location. This is one of those improvements that might not seem like a big deal, but actually having your armies randomly run halfway across the world for no reason was a big drawback. Nice to see that fixed. Reinforcements will now only arrive after the battalions leave their current battle. No more quickly running in and topping up the reserves. Moreover, though, battle conditions, those things that can affect a fight, anything from your morale, your soldiers, right the way out to the geography, now have a chance to update after having been active for several days. This ensures that the tides of battles can turn more easily. And alongside generals now being more aggressive and consistent in pursuing their war goals, even when the war goals are perhaps a little bit too far away, we also have a really nice quality of life change that you can now get to choose to recruit one of 3 instead of 2 generals or admirals. A small thing, but a nice improvement, and I think it sort of goes to show that the level of detail that we're getting into here through all of these patch notes. I'm going to gloss over a few of the changes, of course they'll all be linked below, and pull out a couple more key ones from the improvement list. A few changes to treaty ports. It's now possible to use the Take Treaty Port war goal on a treaty port where you already own part of the state, even if the holder is of higher or equal power rank. And furthermore, it's now possible to take treaty ports from isolationist countries and trade with their market if you hold such a port. Here's looking at you, Japan. Speaking of Japan and the Pacific, colonizable Pacific islands now have the severe malaria trait to discourage early colonization, another slap down in the colonial sphere, and Western Australia, New South Wales, and Japan now start with colonial resettlement by default. Jumping down the list slightly, a few specific changes to some nations that might be of interest. Britain now starts the game with more agriculture and textile industries. Russia now starts the game with even more agriculture in Ukraine. And the USA event option that annexes Indian territory will no longer be selected by the AI if the Indian territory is controlled by a human player, perhaps a little niche, but it's there. And I've just realized that I've been reading this list through twice. I won't bother making you read through it all twice. Thankfully, I've picked up on that. But those are a general feel for the overall improvements inside of this patch. Of course, there are many more, like I say, patch notes linked below. Let's move through now to a different category, one that will affect every single player in every single game: AI. The AI is hopefully becoming a lot better at fighting, knowing when to fight, when to back down, and also generally being more adept at the game. The AI will now never remove the last level of port in a state, and it will also refrain from constructing more ports than it could support financially. Its bravery has been renamed recklessness, and the AI will now better balance its forces between defending home HQs and sending troops to overseas fronts, potentially changing the makeup of the game. Again, this will require a little bit of playtesting to figure out. The AI's technologies are now scripted as well. The AI waits to fine-tune the AI's decision-making when selecting new research, hopefully allowing it to pick what it needs. And high recklessness, that previously known as bravery, will now cause the AI to overestimate its military strength in diplomatic plays, thereby increasing its confidence. So hopefully, leading into these changes, we'll also see a little bit more diversity between nations. Nations that should perhaps be more reckless are now more likely to push the aggressive and perhaps have a level of overconfidence to themselves. And of course, we can probably assume the opposite is true. Less brave, less reckless nations may be less likely to engage, and rightly so. The AI is also better at responding to political movements, from the open beta tweet mod from One Proud Bavarian and Doodles, people who get mentioned a lot in this patch notes. A huge shout out to the both of you. Adding to the AI's staunchness in what is perhaps one of the most impressive sections of the patch notes, the AI is better at responding to political movements, yes, but they're also less likely to back down in diplomatic plays where there are numerous primary demands against them, especially if they'll be annexed upon backing down. Like you'll see me pull off in this gameplay, they'll be hesitant to give everything up because they know that everything is on the line. The AI is also a little bit smarter in some other areas. They'll no longer downsize government buildings while they're in a single civil war, and the AI will now hire enough generals to effectively garrison their HQs, for example, repelling naval invasions. The AI has also been helped by essentially removing some of the stalemates or death spirals that it was previously stuck in. The AI no longer gets stuck in a spiral of low infrastructure due to the underemployed railways. The AI is now better at prioritizing construction and usage of logging camps, obviously pretty important. Perhaps adding a bit more to the AI's strategic nous, a few more points. The AI is now less likely to take sides in diplomatic plays without a good reason for doing so. It's not just going to yeet itself in for no good cause. They've also reduced the overall aggression levels of the AI, as it was overtuned to compensate for bugs listed below. So they've fixed some bugs and reduced the aggression overall. However, it is more aggressive against ideological enemies, and less aggressive, of course, against ideological allies. Again, hopefully adding more of a story, narrative, and individuality to these nations. AI is now generally better at constructing peace deals as well, that might end up ceding war goals to both sides, and the AI now has an improved understanding of which war goals are more important than others to press, and not have pressed on themselves. Finally, the AI is less likely, now less random, about how it has sympathy for in a diplomatic play, and more inclined to support allies and subjects. So, again, hopefully adding a level of personality and individuality here. Leading into that just a little bit more, the AI now completes expeditions more regularly. It now places higher importance on conquering land-adjacent states. Very important, of course, because that just makes sense. And back to the ideological front, it's now more aggressive against council republics, if they are themselves not one. And it's more aggressive against countries with radical economic laws, like workers' co-ops and command economies, again, if they themselves don't share in that radical economic law. Moving on from the suite of improvements to the AI, again full patch notes below, there are some key interface changes. I'm going to cover off either the new ones or the most important ones here. Firstly, there was a complete overhaul of the trade routes panel, adding several different views, options to filter, sort, and manage them. A much better system, in my opinion. The message settings control panel, of course, is also available up in the top right, and you can channel all kinds of behavior around the notifications if you're tired of hearing about lots of little things that don't really matter to you. And on the accessibility front, rebindable hotkeys. And of course, you will have noticed many other interface changes on your screen in the video or in previous videos where we've talked about patch 1.2. I won't go through them all, but alongside those individual notification changes, there's all kinds of changes to population panels, to overviews, map overviews, seeing loyalists and radicals, and of course we have more information up the top, like our number of convoys, for example. New map modes, including the literacy map mode, the infamy map mode, and the global population map mode, join a score of sort of extra levels that we can use to judge the game and to judge how well we're performing. Again, just offering a little bit more information to players in perhaps a less text-based way. We see that again in our production methods as well, where they're now visualized with an image, not just words. And of course, the production methods themselves also display a short summary of what they do, without having to read the entire tooltip. Again, some of these changes inspired by the many wonderful community modders, this one, the Visual Methods mod by Fun. A few improvements here to naval battles. Ongoing naval battles are now accessible through the War panel. Great, more information is always good. Slightly off topic, but conscripted troops are now illustrated by an image suitable for their production methods. And then back on the naval front, when you start a naval invasion, the number of battalions and currently mobilized level is now displayed for each general. And I found, even though it's a simple change, it made my naval invasions in this gameplay much better, and I felt like I had a little bit more control, even though it was still a little bit like just throwing them out there and hoping that they land. It's nice to see more player agency, and of course we get a lot more information in land-based battles now as well. Everything from our troops' morale, supply, etc., the number of troops on the front line, generally the tooltips, or when you hover over a battle and look into more information, you'll find a lot more information there. Some examples of that information coming to light, including, by the way, some more changes to population needs, the tooltip now more readable, is that generals and admirals are now more open about which headquarters they belong to. Battle tooltips now include manpower metrics, as well as battalion or flotilla numbers. And that, of course, combines with a suite of changes that we've already discussed to the military, to convoys, and to strategic objectives. So hopefully you can see how some of this is starting to all fit together. In theory, we have a smarter AI. It knows how to pick its battles better, what's going to be a win or a loss, and ideologically what grounds it should be fighting on. We're combining that with extra information about our troops and slightly more player agency through those strategic objectives and a suite of other changes. Hopefully, we're building a story here and it's going to play out in practice. Let's move through now to the next section. Thankfully, these ones are a little smaller, so we can pull out the detail much easier. We'll now talk about performance. 2 weeks ago, we did a deep dive on ticks and performance in Victoria 3. I was blown away by the level of detail that they offered, not just because most of it went entirely over my head, but also it was nice to see some transparency. And indeed in the comments, many of you picked up on that too. Performance overall is set to get better in this patch, and overall, we've seen actually some fairly decent changes, especially as we start to move through into the later game, an area that is, I'm aware of, particular issue for many Victoria 3 players. They've tried to reduce memory usage by optimizing country trends and pop need caches, so hopefully you'll find that'll help out. There's also been an overhaul of the construction queue related to code to optimize performance and improve the autonomous investments too, so you can see how it's also reaching out to some of the newer features. There were, of course, a suite of other optimizations, from everything to the pollution visual effect particle counts, to trade route map and its interaction code to eliminate lag spikes. Across the board, you should see improvements to Victoria 3's performance in this patch. A category that I'm not sure we've seen before, or at least not much in patch notes, art. That's right, art. Building power plants now cause a representative building model to appear in cities. Whaling stations now have unique production method icons. Smoke plumes produced during and after battles are now visually enhanced, and the presence of mass migration target in a state will now increase the number of horse and carriages on the road. Also, flamethrower visual effects have now been improved. Sick. Overall, of course, these are relatively minor changes, but they do help to add to that living world, something they've talked a little bit about in some of the more ideological or visionary developer diaries that we saw earlier in the year or perhaps late last year. As you can see, there were also a suite of localization improvements. I won't go over them too much here, but as you can see, Korean, Chinese, Polish, and English all saw some fixes, some of them relatively minor, some likely to be more profound. The next category are changes to modding, and here I don't think there's a lot of value in me going into the granular detail, because it's unlikely that these changes will affect a lot of you, unless of course you're actively working in the modding community, in which case these are probably the most important things to you in the entire video. The headline is that new UI function makes scope available for all UI types with a corresponding scope type, letting modders add scripted GUIs. Access saved variables and modifiers in the UI script. Obviously, a little over my pay grade. I'm going to leave the changes on screen as I have, just so you can go through and read them if they apply to you, and other than that, we're going to move along to the next category in the patch notes. A suite of major bug fixes have arrived. Of course, again, I won't go through each and every one, but important to note that tariffs are no longer collected for routes between countries with trade agreement packs. Nice. They also fixed the issue where remobilization of battalions involved in a naval invasion could cause multiple simultaneous landing battles. Nice to see a little more love shown to the naval invasions. Countries that cease to exist for unrelated reasons will now be properly removed from wars, ensuring that the war will conclude eventually. This of course goes alongside changes to the AI, where it's less likely to stay in a constant grinding war, and many other things that will hopefully help make that system a little more punctual and snappy. On the topic of annexation, the East India Company is now annexed upon its formation of India, rather than continuing to just exist on the map. And annexing a country through unification, for example the Hudson Bay Company or Columbia District, will now inherit their claims. A nice touch. And there are a suite of more minor bug fixes. I won't go through them all, but it is no longer possible to humiliate a country twice in a war, and a subject gained through transfer subject war goal should no longer come with some of their land permanently occupied. There were a variety of rare crashes, confusing tooltips, issues with land-based trade routes, and more that have been fixed, and of course a suite of crash fixes as well. Crashes relating to country information panels, battle information panels, out-of-sync errors, you name it. There's a whole load of little things here. Again, these are unlikely to affect a lot of you, but when they do, they're really significant. So it's nice to see them swept through. If there's one in particular that you're looking for, again, patch notes below. Now, onto some information about the update. At the end of the developer diary, they say that they're really happy with how Update 1.2 has turned out, and they hope that, of course, we will be too, thanking their beta testers and community modders and all sorts. The update wouldn't have been nearly as balanced and stable if it weren't for all of you, they say. A really nice acknowledgement for people who work really hard in Victoria 3. After the release of Update 1.2, dev diaries are going to go dark for a couple of weeks or so, but they'll be back soon enough with more on what's coming for Victoria 3 in the near future. So we should expect, when 1.2 rolls out on the 13th of March, to not hear a little bit about Victoria 3 for a wee while. Of course, there are plenty of other exciting Paradox games coming out, which I covered the other day on the channel. They've got their work cut out for them, it's clear. But it's nice to see patch 1.2 rolling through. The planned release date, as I say, is Monday the 13th of March, and it's planned to go live at 10 Central European Time. Their testing showed, by the way, quite a reasonable level of compatibility with old saves. However, as always, you should probably start a new campaign. However, you always have the option to roll back to a previous version on Steam if you need to. And that concludes today's coverage of the gargantuan patch 1.2 patch notes. Of course, I have gone through and covered some of the specific areas and new features with dedicated videos already, things like the private economy or the war changes, so you're welcome to check those out on the channel if you want to. That'll do for today. Thank you very much for joining me. I'll see you next time.